So let's take a look at the history of feminism and give a broad outline. In other courses, we'll do deeper dives into each wave of feminism, look more at in more detail at the writings of feminists. But it's a vast history, and we can't do it full justice in this course. And this is why we'll have more in-depth courses where we can look at a lot of the writings and the arguments used by feminist thinkers throughout history. But for our purposes, in this course, we just want to lay out an outline so that we can start to understand what is it that feminists have said, what is the evolution of their ideas, and how have these ideas impacted Muslims. So you might be familiar with a whitewashed history of feminism. And what does that history look like? There is this claim that we discussed with the patriarchal thesis that women have been oppressed throughout history by the patriarchy. Women have been subjugated, and women have protested this patriarchy throughout history as well. Most of these women we don't know about because they were so oppressed that even their complaints about being oppressed have been lost to historical time. We know the details of many different civilizations and many different thinkers going back thousands of years, but somehow we just don't have any kind of historical reference to which would validate the patriarchal thesis and validate the feminist claim about all of these terribly oppressed women throughout all of human history. Then suddenly in the 19th century, women finally start to organize politically. They finally get their act together and they start organizing. And this culminated with the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, where women are finally standing up for their rights and finally standing up to the patriarchy in 1848. Thousands of years prior to that, no woman, I guess, was smart enough to figure out how to come together as a group to advocate for their political rights and overturn this patriarchy once and for all. No, it took women thousands of years, reaching 1848, where they got together and decided that they deserve rights. So, what are the waves of feminism? The first wave, starting in 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention in America, 1848 to 1949. That's generally seen as first wave feminism. You should also understand that the waves, the whole idea of feminism coming in waves is disputed. Some feminists will bristle at that idea that there are waves because it shows how feminism is a confused concept that evolves, and it evolves with culture, and it's not like a principled thing. That kind of undermines feminism. So they will not like this idea of waves. Others will say that, well, the waves, it's not you can't really define them very clearly. Each wave, it's not like they called themselves, oh, we're the first wave, we're the second wave, the feminists within those time periods. So they'll say this is just a kind of category, taxonomy that is being imposed on the history, and there are blurred edges, basically, which is fine. Like, I agree with that as well. You can't really clearly say that, no, the first wave was at this time, the second wave was at this time, the third wave has a clear start and end date. No, you can't say that. But for the general purpose of understanding the progression of the feminist movement, I think it's a useful framework. Second wave, 1949 to 1980s. 1949 is an arbitrary date, by the way. It's coinciding with the publication of The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir in 1949. So it's an arbitrary date, but you can argue that Simone de Beauvoir was one of the major thinkers of feminism within the 20th century, and she kind of introduced certain ideas that were not found with feminism prior to that. So That is a lot of historians will mark the publication of her book as the beginning of the second wave. The third wave, 1980s to the 2000s. Once you start getting to the third wave, then it becomes a lot more amorphous, a lot more vague and ambiguous. When does it actually start? Was it the 80s? Was it the late 70s? Was it the 90s? Some people will say the 90s. It doesn't really matter to have an exact date, but it will make more sense when we talk about the actual ideas and figures. Fourth wave generally is like in the internet age. Some will claim that there is not really a fourth wave. We're still in the third wave of feminism. Some will say no, there's a very clear difference between what we see in the fourth wave versus the third wave in terms of ideas and methods and approaches. There's a different generation. You know, we're talking about whether it's Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Z, millennials versus non-millennials versus boomers. Like these kinds of generational distinctions also play a role. So that is kind of a whitewashed general history of feminism. And we'll talk more about exactly what is entailed in each of the waves. But I have a different way to categorize all of this. We should start with the zero wave. The zero wave of feminism that precedes the first wave. I think this is very important to identify a zero wave of feminism because we have to look at the progression and the evolution of feminist thought and the origins of feminist thought. It's not in the 19th century. It's not 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention. That's not the first origins of feminist thought, even as a political movement. Rather, feminism emerged with liberalism pretty much at the same time. So the actual first wave, which I'm calling the zero wave, started with figures like John Stuart Mill, a big proponent of colonialism, a major white supremacist. Figures like Marie de Gournay, Jeremy Bentham, the famous utilitarian, which you might remember from our course Godless Creeds, Francois de la Barre, Olympe de Gouges, Mary Wollstonecraft. These are the figures that started talking about the role of women, the rights of women, the liberation of women, and they predate 1848. These are figures that will go back as far as the 17th century. The 17th century, Marie de Gournay actually goes to the 16th century. So this is at the dawn of modernism. The dawn of modernism, if you remember from Dark Storms. Modernism begins in the 16th century, and you have women already who are philosophers or writers, very few of them, but they're writing about the idea of women's liberation. So it coincides with the rise of modernism, coincides with the rise of liberalism. And this is important. This is important to identify. Why? Well, we'll see. It's because the rise of feminism and the rise of liberalism and the rise of modernism coincide with the rise of colonialism, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, with the rise of these kinds of world events that are destroying the world, that are subjugating large portions of the Earth's population under this, vampire of colonialism. So we need to attach feminism to that entire history of Europe. So what are the main ideas that these individuals are talking about? Whether it's John Stuart Mill, whether it's Jeremy Bentham, whether it's whoever, they're talking about the schooling of women, that women need better education, that the reason why so many cultural achievements are primarily from men is because women haven't had the same kind of access to education. These are the arguments that you'll find. You'll find people like John Stuart Mill advocating for women's schooling, that public education. Many of the Enlightenment thinkers are advocating for public education, and they think that it's important for women to be a part of that education. Women actually need to be educated so they can contribute to the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, these things that are reshaping society. And in the minds of these figures, one of the main reasons that the West is superior, that the European race, that the white race is superior to Muslims, Chinese, Indian, natives, is because you have education, you have science, you have the ability to create the Industrial Revolution, to do empirical science. This is the mark of civilization that makes the West superior. They were white supremacists. And education is a big part of that. So women also need to be a part of that, because women are going to be the mothers of children. And it's in fact backwards. The backwards barbarians of the rest of the world that treat women poorly, that keep them out of education, keep them out of science. This is the kind of argument that these white supremacists, Enlightenment thinkers are making to justify their colonial project, actually. They want to bring the savages to the light of reason. A lot of the discourse also in this zero wave of feminism has to do with liberation, has to do with the conflict between liberation and servitude. You have this kind of liberal ideology that is growing from the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And feminists, the zero wave feminists, are also advocating for the liberation of women as well, as a class, as a category. This is new. This is rising with liberal discourse. And as we know from previous courses, from other courses that you might have taken already, that liberalism is very anti-tradition. And tradition is patriarchal, tradition is hierarchical, and there are gender roles and there are gender distinctions. But as we know, liberalism is opposed to any and all traditions. And you have this tendency of the liberal to want to optimize and change, to create a better situation, to create advancement, to create improvement and progress. This is the progressivism of modernist thought. So if there are gender roles, this is holding us back. If there's a hierarchy between men and women, this is holding us back. Let's consider actually dissolving these distinctions, dissolving these roles, and perhaps we can advance. So from the beginning, liberalism is an anti-patriarchy, because patriarchy is traditional. So part of the European self-conception as superior and civilized is because of its treatment of women. We are educating our women. These other people are not. We have outlawed polygamy, whereas polygyny, one man having multiple wives, is practiced by the Indians, the Chinese, the Muslims, the natives. They all practice polygyny, but us, the superior West, we don't have this practice. Obviously, it's a remnant of Christianity and how the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestants eventually as well, they outlawed polygamy completely. But that also became one of the sticking points for the secularized Enlightenment thinkers. What distinguishes civilized society from barbaric societies of the natives, the Africans, the Mohammedans, is our treatment of women. This is a sign, this is a mark of superiority. This becomes one of the main ideas and main themes of zero-wave feminism. So you can see how the feminist discourse of today would not want to talk much about the feminists of this period, because they're very racist. They're very supremacist, white supremacist. So you don't want to associate the origins of your movement, the feminist movement, with racists and white supremacists and colonial powers, colonial discourse. You want to sweep that under the rug and pretend that it never happened and never existed. So this is why they don't talk about as of the first wave of feminism starting in the 17th century or the early 18th century. The other point is that when we are tracing feminism and the origins of feminism to this point of period that sees a lot of industrialization, the scientific revolution has happened, the industrial revolution is happening, and this is also when feminism just starts to arise, then it makes sense that other societies that have not been industrialized are not going to have feminism, are not going to arrive at this kind of feminism, are not going to have the conditions that are conducive to kind of liberal feminist thought. So this also debunks the feminist idea that feminism is a kind of universal struggle. Feminism is a universal consciousness that women throughout history have had. No, women have not had this consciousness. It's only arisen in one particular point in history that coincides with industrialization and modernization, the technological revolution. Like you had a certain social upheaval because of technology and industrialization, which has had many negative effects, many disastrous effects, as we've discussed in other courses. But if you have that in your society, then you will see a rise in feminism and liberalization as well. These things are intimately intertwined, and you shouldn't expect it to be universal. You shouldn't expect all these other religions, all these other cultures, all these other civilizations to have also had feminism, exist amongst its women, or these kinds of feminist impulses, the feminist project, the feminist mystique manifesto. None of that could have existed if you don't have industrialization, if you don't have modernization, if you don't have liberalization. So this completely deflates the presumption of universality that feminists operate with when we properly situate the beginning of feminism to its actual origins at the dawn of industrialization and modernization, as opposed to this arbitrary first wave in the whitewashed history of feminism that places it in 1848, not tied to any major historical change or upheaval of civilization and history. So colonialism, this is something that is intertwined with the liberal project overall. White supremacy, the white man's burden to civilize the rest of society, and feminism is also intertwined with that. So the colonial thinkers justifying the colonial project, justifying civilizing all of these colonies and the people around the world, the savages, it's always been intertwined with gender. This idea that these people are inherently misogynistic, and that's why we have to civilize them. Colonialism is necessary to defend women's rights and rescue women, to save the brown woman from the brown man. That is the white man's burden. And this becomes a major justification for colonialism, if not the central justification for colonialism of the Muslim world, of Africa, of Native Americans, of South America, and on and on. It's all about protecting the women. And if you remember from the introduction, how men have this instinct to protect the women, to protect the vulnerable, this can be a strong moral justification when you tie it to a colonial imperial project. So now we established the zero wave and how it had so much to do with colonialism. This is something that feminists will avoid trying to talk about, or will avoid putting the start of their movement in the colonial period. What you will have third wave feminists say, and we'll get to it, they will say, yeah, you had white feminism, and we disagree with white feminism, but now we've recaptured the true essence of feminism, and that's what we're advocating for. We'll evaluate the whether that makes sense or not. But let's look at the first wave. The modern feminists acknowledge the first wave, which, again, we said was 1848 as the beginning. And the main figures: Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Margaret Sanger, Rebecca Ann Latimer Felton, Frances Willard. These are some of the main figures. And the main ideas: they were concerned about voting, suffrage, basically women's suffrage, equality before the law, property rights, college access, radically reforming religion, and also eugenics. Such as abortion, family planning, contraception. This was also a big concern of the first wave feminists for very racist reasons, as we'll see. But again, all of this is whitewashed. We have this kind of propaganda about feminism that, the first wave was all about women's rights in terms of voting, and women just wanted the right to vote. And it's kind of made to seem innocuous or innocent. Like, yeah, these first wave suffragettes, first wave feminists, they were very sympathetic figures. Actually, no. If you look at the details of these figures, they were all racist. They were very anti-black. They were also atheists. They were also very irreligious. If they weren't atheists, they were agnostic. They were rabid anti-Christian, anti-God, and especially Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. This witch wanted to write a women's Bible. She wanted to say that, women, this God of the Bible, this is a man's God, but women can write Revelation as well. So this is the first wave, like very radical, not sympathetic at all for at least any person who believes in God, any person who believes in tradition. They wanted to destroy everything, and they spoke very loudly against religion and even Islam. They included Islam as one of the patriarchal religions that needed to be radically reformed, if not completely destroyed. They're not sympathetic figures at all. So let's go to some examples of their racism, for example. So when you look up the Seneca Falls Convention, they had some resolutions, 12 resolutions that they agreed upon at the culmination of this convention. But usually when you read about it on mainstream sources, they don't list the actual resolutions. And if you research it, you might find that very curious. Why won't the articles that are referencing Seneca Falls Convention, why don't they actually list the conventions? Like, it shouldn't take that long. Just do a block quote in your article so that we can read it and see what this was really about. But then if you do a bit more digging, you'll have to go to like academic websites, not mainstream high traffic websites. You have to kind of dig a little deeper to see what the resolutions are. And then you realize, okay, this is why. This is why these people who are trying to champion feminism and portray feminism as this amazing movement that we all should support, they're not going to cite the resolution because it has some very politically incorrect statements within it. So this is a quote. He has withheld from her rights, he meaning like men, the patriarchy, have withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. So the most ignorant and degraded men are natives and foreigners. So they're not going to put this in the article about these rabid racists that are convening in 1848. And then one of the resolutions makes it even more explicit. Resolve, this is one of the resolutions, that the equality of human rights results necessarily from the fact of the identity of the race in capabilities and responsibilities. So this is why women are these white women are the same race as the white men. So they have to have the same capabilities, and therefore they should have the same responsibilities. And this is a fact, this is a necessary fact, that they should have the same rights. It's because of the identity of race, which is why women, these white women, should be granted the right to vote, right to political participation, because of the fact that they are white as opposed to other races. And this was actually a big deal, a big sticking point for these first wave feminists, is because the right to vote had been granted to black men at that time within American history after the Civil War. Black men could vote, and a lot of these feminists, if not all of them, who were politically active, pointed this out as a huge injustice. Why is it that black men can vote but the white woman cannot? And so they made this resolution. This is an argument, like they're trying to make a logical argument, like races are equal in terms of their rational capabilities. So why are the inferior blacks able to vote but not the white women? We're the same race as the white men. We have the superior intelligence and rationality and capability than these black men. So it's a capital injustice that white women are not allowed to vote. So this is why you're not going to see mainstream sources. They will cite the Seneca Falls Convention, but they will not actually quote from their resolutions. So there are a lot of quotes that we want to read about from these first wave feminists just to drive in the point. But we'll save it for the next module, and you can see all of these shocking quotes.